After, ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing right now is not just another change in the news cycle, not another political reshuffle or market correction. No, this moment, this global shift is bigger than anyone realizes. The ground beneath the world economy is moving quietly but powerfully and most people are too distracted by daily headlines to notice. You see, the real history doesn't announce itself with breaking news banners. It unfolds in slow, profound transformations that redefine how humanity organizes production, power, and life itself. And that is exactly what's happening right now. For decades, the world has operated under a global system dominated by one power structure, Western capitalism, led by the United States. After World War II, that system reigned supreme. The US dollar became the world's currency. American corporations expanded everywhere and the promise of free markets was sold as the ultimate path to prosperity. But like every empire in history, this one too carries the seeds of its own decline. What we're seeing now, the rise of new economic powers, the fragmentation of global alliances, after the unraveling of trust in Western financial systems, is not chaos, it's transition. The global South, long treated as the supplier of cheap labor and raw materials, is beginning to assert itself. After countries once colonized and exploited are now demanding a seat at the table, refusing to be economic spectators. China, India, Brazil, Russia, and countless others are building alternatives, new trade routes, new currencies, new alliances. The BRICS expansion is not just about economics. It's about ending a world order where decisions made in Washington or London determine the fate of billions elsewhere. So that's the global shift I'm talking about. Meanwhile, inside the West itself, the contradictions are exploding. The working class, once promised a share in prosperity, now faces stagnating wages, disappearing pensions, and rising inequality. The same system that preached efficiency now produces homelessness next to luxury condos, food waste beside hunger, corporate bailouts while families drown in debt. The middle class, that proud creation of 20th century capitalism, is being hollowed out. And when the system can no longer deliver for the majority, it begins to lose legitimacy. That's not just economics, that's the beginning of political transformation. You see, the global shift isn't only about East versus West or North versus South. It's about people versus systems that no longer serve them. Across continents, workers are organizing. Young people are rejecting the old narratives, and even within capitalist countries, faith in the system is crumbling. When millions of people begin to ask the same question, why are we working harder but living worse? That's when history starts to move. Look around, nations are moving to trade without the US dollar. Global corporations are losing their grip. And even the IMF and World Bank face challengers they never imagined. The American model of endless consumption, credit expansion, and corporate dominance is colliding with the limits of the planet and the patience of its people. And when the foundation of a global system begins to crack, the elite will always try to distract you with culture wars, with partisan theater, with fear. But none of that changes the fact that the world is reorganizing itself. This shift will be messy, uneven, and full of contradictions. Some countries will rise, others will fall. Some people will cling to the old system while others build the new one. But make no mistake, the age of one economic model dominating the globe is ending. The future is multipolar, multi-centered, and uncertain. And that uncertainty is not a curse, it's an opportunity. For the first time in decades, humanity has a chance to rethink what kind of economy we want, who it serves, and what values it upholds. For much of the last century, the world has lived under an economic order defined and dominated by the West. The United States, emerging victorious from World War II, inherited not just military supremacy, but also economic leadership. Through institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the World Trade Organization, it built a framework that ensured Western capital and corporations would control the flow of trade, technology, and finance across the globe. The U.S., after dollar became the world's reserve currency, Western banks dictated credit, and Western markets set the prices for everything from oil to grain. But every empire, no matter how powerful, carries within itself the contradictions that eventually erode its dominance. What we are witnessing today is the slow, visible unraveling of that long-standing control, the end of Western economic dominance. This end did not arrive overnight. It has been decades in the making, quietly gathering force beneath the surface of globalization. In the post-war years, after the United States and its allies outsourced their manufacturing to cheaper labor markets, pursuing profit maximization over long-term stability. Corporations abandoned industrial production at home in favor of financial speculation abroad. The result was predictable. While shareholders and executives grew richer, Western workers were left with stagnant wages, precarious employment, and vanishing industries. The very system that had made the West wealthy began hollowing out its productive base. Meanwhile, the countries that were once seen as peripheral, China to India, Brazil, and others, used the same globalization process to strengthen themselves, to learn, to innovate, and eventually to challenge the old order that had exploited them. Now those nations are no longer content to simply participate in a Western design system. They are creating new institutions, new alliances, and new rules. The BRICS bloc, once dismissed as symbolic, has become a serious alternative to Western dominance. The nations are settling trade in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar. Infrastructure projects funded by non-Western powers are connecting continents without requiring the approval of Washington or Brussels. For the first time in generations, the world economy is no longer centered on one pole. Power is diffusing. The world is becoming multipolar. And for those who built their fortunes on control, that diffusion feels like a collapse. The Western ruling class responds to this shift with anxiety disguised as diplomacy. They speak of maintaining global order or defending democracy, but these are euphemisms for defending economic privilege. The wars, sanctions, and trade restrictions we see today are desperate attempts to preserve a system that no longer commands unquestioned loyalty. The rest of the world is beginning to reject the moral authority of nations that lecture about free markets while manipulating them, that preach democracy while supporting dictators who serve their interests. That hypocrisy is no longer hidden, it is exposed for all to see. Inside the Western nations, the story is no brighter. The promises that capitalism once made, security, opportunity, upward mobility, have faded. The young generations face debt, unaffordable housing, and precarious futures. Social services are dismantled while military budgets expand. The economy that once claimed to be the engine of freedom has turned into a mechanism of extraction. Wealth moves upward while insecurity spreads downward. The same financial system that dominates globally also exploits domestically. It is no coincidence that Western elites lose legitimacy at home just as they lose influence abroad. The end of Western economic dominance, then, is not simply about geopolitical realignment. It is the culmination of internal contradictions, the result of decades of prioritizing profit over people, finance over production, and control over cooperation. The system built on exploitation, whether of foreign labor or domestic workers, has reached its limits. The world that was once divided between producers and consumers, developed and developing, is collapsing under the weight of its own inequality. But endings also mark beginnings. As Western control fades, space opens for new arrangements. Not necessarily better by default, but filled with potential. Nations of the global South can now negotiate from strength, not subservience. After workers in the West can rediscover solidarity with those abroad, understanding that their struggles are connected, not opposed. After the decline of one power structure creates the possibility for a more balanced, democratic, and humane global economy, if we have the courage to build it. So yes, the end of Western economic dominance is not a tragedy, it is a reckoning. The world is no longer willing to be ruled by a few at the expense of the many. The illusion that one civilization, one currency, after one ideology could forever dictate the terms of existence is breaking apart. The global economy is being rewritten not by decree, but by necessity. After history is not ending, it is redistributing itself. The question is not whether the West will lose dominance. That process is already underway. After. The question is whether humanity will learn from this shift, whether we will build a world that values cooperation over competition, equity over empire, after and life over profit. For much of modern history, the global stage has been dominated by a single central power, first by European empires, then by the United States. The 20th century was defined by that unipolar moment when one nation, one currency, and one ideology dictated the rhythm of the world economy. But history has never tolerated permanence in power. After. What we are witnessing now is not a temporary fluctuation, not a passing trend. It is the rise of a multipolar world. It is the slow dismantling of a system that concentrated wealth, power, and decision-making in a handful of Western capitals, and the emergence of a new global order shaped by many centers, many voices, and many interests. After this transformation did not begin in a boardroom or through diplomatic treaties, it began through the contradictions of capitalism itself. After, when Western corporations sought cheaper labor and higher profits, they exported their industries across the globe. They built factories in Asia, after extracted minerals from Africa and outsourced services to Latin America. In the short term, it worked brilliantly for corporate profits. But in doing so, they transferred not just jobs, they transferred knowledge, technology, and capacity. The so-called peripheral nations absorbed these lessons to develop their infrastructure and began to stand on their own feet. After the same process that was supposed to enrich the West at everyone else's expense became the foundation for others to rise. China is perhaps the clearest example of this transformation. Once dismissed as a low-wage manufacturing hub, it now stands as the world's second largest economy, a technological powerhouse, and a strategic counterweight to U.S. influence. India, too, is emerging not only as a market, but as a producer of ideas, technology, and global partnerships. Russia, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and others are no longer content to play supporting roles in an American-led drama. They are rewriting the script entirely. Together, after these nations form the nucleus of a new kind of global alignment, one based not on subordination, but on mutual necessity. After the formation and expansion of alliances like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are not coincidences. They are signs of structural change. They reflect a global yearning for autonomy after decades of Western dominance. The push for trade in local currencies, the creation of alternative financial systems, and the rise of new regional institutions are all pieces of a larger movement. A movement to decentralize global power. This is what multipolarity truly means, the diffusion of authority, the diversification of leadership, and the end of monopoly control. The old system is struggling to accept this reality. After, Western policymakers often describe the new world as unstable or dangerous, as though order existed only when they were in charge. They view cooperation among non-Western nations as a threat rather than a sign of progress. But what is truly dangerous is the arrogance of believing that one model, one culture, or one economic structure can serve as the universal blueprint for all of humanity. That illusion has already led to wars, debt crises, and environmental destruction. The rise of a multipolar world is in essence a rejection of that illusion. Yet, after this shift is not purely about geopolitics. It is also about economics and class. Within each nation, after power is being contested between elites who want to preserve the old order and ordinary people who want something different. After the same forces of inequality that hollowed out the Western middle class also exist globally. A multipolar world will mean little if it simply replaces one ruling elite with another. Its real potential lies in creating economic systems that prioritize cooperation over competition, sustainability over exploitation, and dignity over profit. We must also recognize that multipolarity is not a guarantee of harmony. It will bring complexity, friction, and uncertainty. Competing interests will clash, and new forms of dominance may emerge. But even with all its risks, this transition is healthier than the stagnant, after hierarchical system it replaces. Diversity of power creates space for negotiation, experimentation, and alternative models of development. It allows nations and people to chart their own course rather than following dictates from financial centers thousands of miles away. The West can resist this shift with sanctions, propaganda, and threats, but it cannot stop it. History has already moved. The global balance is adjusting to reflect the realities of the 21st century. A world where power is distributed, not concentrated, where cooperation is essential, not optional. The question for Western leaders is whether they will adapt to this new world or continue to fight for an order that no longer exists. For ordinary people, after this transformation carries both danger and hope. Danger, because the old powers will not surrender quietly. Hope, because a multipolar world offers the possibility of new beginnings. It offers a chance for nations to learn from one another instead of exploiting one another, for societies to redefine progress beyond profit. And for workers everywhere to realize that their struggles are connected across borders. The rise of a multipolar world is not just a shift in geopolitics, it is the next chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle to build a fairer and more balanced world. After the unipolar moment was an era of dominance, the multipolar age can be an era of dialogue. If we choose cooperation over coercion, respect over rivalry, and justice over greed, then this new world will not merely replace the old, it will transcend it. The age of one empire ruling all is ending. The age of shared destiny is only beginning. The crisis unfolding within Western economies today is not a sudden accident. Nor is it the result of one bad policy or a few corrupt politicians. It is the product of a system that has reached its internal limits, a structure that can no longer conceal the contradictions upon which it was built. For decades, the West presented itself as the model of economic success. After the shining example of prosperity and stability, it promised that free markets and private enterprise would lift all boats, that hard work and innovation would guarantee comfort and security. But behind the glittering surface of wealth and technology, a deep rot was spreading. Inequality, debt, and disillusionment. Now that rot can no longer be hidden. The crisis is not coming, it is already here. Embedded in the daily life of millions who struggle to survive in economies that no longer serve them. The foundation of this crisis lies in the transformation of Western capitalism over the last half century. In the mid-20th century, after the devastation of the Great Depression and World War II, the system was forced to make concessions to the working class. Strong unions, public services, and stable jobs created the illusion of a balanced society. But beginning in the 1970s, that balance was deliberately dismantled. The rise of neoliberalism, privatization, deregulation, and the globalization of production shifted power from labor to capital. Factories were closed, jobs were sent overseas, and wages were frozen while corporate profits soared. The social contract that once tied workers to their nations was broken in the name of efficiency and free markets. The results are visible everywhere. In the United States, Britain, and across Europe, wealth has concentrated in the hands of a small elite while the majority faces stagnation. The middle class, once celebrated as the cornerstone of Western democracy, is shrinking and sinking. Young generations enter adulthood burdened by debt. After insecure work and unaffordable housing, the elderly, who were promised retirement with dignity, to find their pensions eroded and healthcare systems collapsing under privatization. The West, once proud of its stability, after now lives under the permanent stress of economic precarity. This is not merely a cycle of bad luck or mismanagement. It is systemic design. After, the Western model increasingly depends on financialization rather than production. Instead of creating real goods or improving lives, their wealth is generated through speculation, debt, and manipulation of markets. Corporations buy back their own stocks to inflate value. Banks gamble with public deposits, and governments rescue the wealthy every time the system falters. Meanwhile, workers are told to tighten their belts, to accept austerity, to be competitive in a race that only the rich can win. Even the political institutions of the West reflect this decay. Democracy has been hollowed out into theater. Politicians from different parties serve the same economic interests, financed by the same corporations and lobbies. Campaigns promise change, but policies remain unchanged because the real power lies not in parliaments but in boardrooms. The working class, disillusioned and betrayed, turns toward anger, nationalism, and scapegoating. Anything to explain their suffering in a system that insists the problem is personal failure, not structural injustice. At the same time, Western economies face the consequences of the very global order they created. By outsourcing production for short-term gain, they weakened their own industrial base. By relying on cheap labor abroad, they destroyed the livelihoods of their own citizens. By prioritizing financial profits, they made their economies fragile and dependent on constant growth that the planet cannot sustain. The pandemic, the energy shocks, and the inflation crisis have simply revealed what was already true, that the system's stability was an illusion built on borrowed time and borrowed money. And yet, the ruling class insists that there is no alternative. They tell us that privatization will solve health care, that deregulation will bring innovation, that cutting public spending will reduce debt. But decades of evidence show the opposite. Inequality widens, infrastructure crumbles, and public trust collapses. The more the system fails, the more desperately its defenders double down on the same failed ideas. The real tragedy is that Western societies have the resources, knowledge, and technology to build economies that meet everyone's needs. What they lack is a structure that allows democratic control over those resources. Instead, decisions are made by those who profit from crisis rather than solve it. When housing becomes unaffordable, real estate investors grow rich. When healthcare collapses, private insurance companies thrive. When wages stagnate, corporations use cheap credit to maintain consumption. In every crisis, the few find opportunity while the many bear the cost. The crisis within Western economies is therefore more than economic. It is moral and political. It reflects a society that has prioritized profit over people, efficiency over empathy, and competition over community. The system has lost its legitimacy because it no longer delivers on its promises. The rhetoric of freedom and opportunity rings hollow when millions are trapped in debt, underpaid, and overworked. The supposed guardians of progress have become architects of decline. What we are seeing is the slow disintegration of a model that can neither reform itself nor sustain itself. The West once defined the global economy. Now it struggles to define its own future. But in this decay lies possibility. When a system reveals its failures so openly, it creates the space for imagination, for alternatives built on solidarity, equality, and collective ownership. After, the crisis is not the end. It is the beginning of reckoning. The question is not whether the Western economy will change, but whether its people will demand that it changes for them, not for the wealthy few who built their fortunes on its collapse. Across the world today, after, an unmistakable tension fills the air, a quiet but growing confrontation between ordinary people and the system that governs their lives. It is not a rebellion of slogans or ideology alone, but one born from exhaustion, from decades of promises unfulfilled and sacrifices demanded in the name of progress. The system tells us to work harder, consume more, and stay quiet. It tells us that if we fail to succeed, it is our fault. Yet no matter how hard people work, the rewards seem to flow upward, never downward. This is the essence of the crisis we face, not just an economic collapse, but a moral and social reckoning. People versus the system that exploits them. For generations, people were told that capitalism, with its free markets and competition, would eventually benefit everyone. The story went that wealth would trickle down, that innovation would create endless opportunities, and that merit would determine success. But for most people, that story has turned into a cruel myth. Wages stagnate while prices soar. Education and healthcare, once considered rights, after have become luxuries. Entire communities are hollowed out as corporations chase cheaper labor abroad. After, the wealth that workers produce every day through their labor ends up in the hands of a few who own the means of production. After, the system is designed to reward ownership, not